Hey everyone, and welcome. Tonight, we're diving straight into the brutal spectacle of the Roman Colosseum. This was an arena where the odds were never even, the lions were always famished, and subtlety was left at the door. So, before we get started, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you're a true fan of what I do. It's always amazing to see where you're all watching from, so drop a comment below with your city and time zone. Now, let's get comfortable. Lower the lights, maybe get a fan running for some white noise, and let's begin tonight's journey. The Roman arena, the brutal truth. When one thinks of the Roman Empire, images that come to mind are of great architectural works, formidable legions, and a legal system that laid the foundation for the Western world. But amidst these glorious legacies stands a monument both magnificent and horrifying, an undeniable symbol of both Rome's greatness and its brutality, the Colosseum. This was not a sports stadium by any modern definition. It was not born to honor sportsmanship or fair competition. The Colosseum was a theater of chaos, a stage where life and death were performed as a bloody play, a tool of power used by emperors with astonishing sophistication. Entering the Colosseum expecting fairness was like bringing a picnic basket into a hurricane. The audience didn't come here to find balance. They didn't come to see who fought best. They came to see who fell most spectacularly, ideally in a tragic drama with flailing arms and a desperate facial expression. Fairness was an optional extra. The lions were always hungry, and subtlety had been thrown into the arena along with the prisoners. This is the story of the Roman arena, where entertainment meant violence, and every drop of blood spilled was a message of power sent to 50,000 spectators. Chapter 1: Bread and Circuses. The true purpose of the games. To understand the existence of the Colosseum, one must first understand the psychology of Roman society. Life in ancient Rome could be incredibly stressful. Plagues, grain shortages, catastrophic fires, and political instability were constant threats. In this context, the Colosseum was not just entertainment. It was a form of civic therapy. Witnessing someone else have a very bad day, even a horrific death, in a controlled environment, was how the populace dealt with their own pressures. It offered a psychological release, a reminder that no matter how hard life was, at least they weren't the ones facing an angry elephant on the arena floor. Furthermore, the games were completely free. They were sponsored by the emperor, turning each event into a massive, public, please-like-me gesture. This policy, known as panem et circenses, bread and circuses, was a genius political strategy. A citizen might be complaining about rising grain prices or a tax hike, but when given a seat in the arena, a few snacks, and a direct view of the carnage, daily worries seem to temporarily vanish. You got your grain, you got a seat, and you got a spectacle. What more could you ask for? The architecture of the Colosseum was also a declaration of inequality. The emperor had the best seat, right in the center, shaded and close enough to give a thoughtful nod when someone was artfully decapitated. The senators sat on comfortable cushions. Everyone else, the common folk, had to cram onto stone benches and endure the scorching sun. And the people actually on the arena floor? They got an audience. The design didn't prioritize fairness. It prioritized the flaunting of power and social hierarchy. It reminded everyone of their place in the Roman pecking order, from the emperor at the top to the condemned prisoner at the bottom. Chapter 2: Uneven Matches, when death was staged. Although fights between two well-trained gladiators did happen, they weren't the most common attraction. The real appeal of the Colosseum for the masses lay in the blatant disparity, where the outcome seemed predetermined before the match even began. 2.1: Professional gladiator versus amateur. This was a cruel tradition where a professionally trained killer faced, for example, a baker holding a sword for the first time, or an official having an existential crisis. These matches weren't mistakes, they were intentionally planned. A gladiator, contrary to the logic of modern films, was not always an anonymous slave. Some were volunteers, some were celebrities, and all were trained to a very high level. They lived in training schools, ludus, had coaches, and followed strict diets and training regimens. They were essentially professional athletes, just with more armor and fewer endorsement deals. Now, imagine pitting one of these athletes against someone who learned to sword fight by watching his shadow on a wall. The result was predictable, and that was the point. This wasn't about suspense, it was about spectacle. The audience didn't want a fair fight. They wanted to cheer for the clear winner while pretending the other guy had a slim chance. For the amateur, they had a few options. Survive long enough to be mildly impressive. If they showed a bit of courage or unexpected skill, they might earn some respect. Survive long enough for the crowd to feel pity. A performance of weakness and desperation could evoke compassion. Be defeated quickly and dramatically. A comical fall or a tragic scream could make the audience laugh, and the emperor nod in approval. If an amateur proved particularly charming or dramatic in his desperation, he might even be spared. The Romans loved an underdog story, especially if the underdog bled moderately and beautifully. 2.2. Damnatio ad bestias, sentence by the beasts. This was a Roman tradition that posed the important question: what if our justice system was also a zoo? Damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts, was Rome's solution for everything from theft to treason. The process was simple. The accused, who might be a thief, a traitor, or simply someone who stared at the emperor's statue for a bit too long, would be brought into the arena. They had no weapons, no armor, just a flimsy tunic and a vague sense of impending doom. Sometimes, they were given a stick, because nothing says fairness like handing someone a twig and telling them to make it look interesting. Then, a gate would open, and a hungry beast would emerge. These weren't your average stray cats. They were imported from North Africa and treated like star performers. They had better transportation than most citizens and sometimes better food. This wasn't a fight. It was a message. The empire didn't just punish you. It turned you into part of the show. The more dramatic your final moments, the louder the crowd cheered, the more the emperor smiled, and the more everyone forgot their rent was overdue. And yes, people brought their children. Why go to the forum when you can teach your kids valuable life lessons like don't cheat or you'll become lunch? Sometimes, the condemned surprised everyone. They ran, they dodged, they climbed things. There is at least one account of a man who played dead so convincingly the lion lost interest. Unfortunately, the crowd did not. They made sure the show went on. 2.3. Venations, the bloody hunts in the arena. When the lion drama was over, the next act might be the Venations, the Roman version of man versus wild. If wild was extremely annoyed and man was wearing gladiator sandals. These were staged hunts where specially trained warriors, or whoever was available, were given weapons and told to try not to look nervous. The arena would be transformed into a mock wilderness with fake trees, imported sand, and maybe a few shrubs if the budget allowed. Then, wild animals were released. Leopards, bears, ostriches, rhinos, crocodiles, basically anything that could trample, maul, or deeply confuse the audience. The warriors had to fight them with spears, nets, or, in some cases, things that were completely useless. And here's the irony. It still wasn't a fair fight, but in the opposite direction. Sometimes, the animals were sick, drugged, or starved to make things more manageable. The goal wasn't survival, it was spectacle. The crowd didn't particularly care about the animals. If a rhino tossed a man into the air like a decorative coin, they would cheer. If the man somehow won, they would cheer louder. Sometimes, the animals even cooperated. In one account, a bear and a lion supposedly ignored the human and started fighting each other. The crowd was ecstatic. Chapter 3. When myth became hell, fatal charades. When the Romans wanted to really impress the audience, they delved into mythology. Because why simply execute someone when you can reenact a myth while doing it? This delightful tradition was called fatal charades. It wasn't a game, but a form of public execution that combined storytelling with creative sentencing. Imagine a condemned man, dressed as Icarus, strapped into fake wings, and pushed off a high platform. No, he did not fly. No, it was not subtle. The Romans loved their myths, the gods, the heroes, the tragic endings. So, instead of quietly disposing of criminals, they reimagined their deaths as performance art. The audience wasn't just watching justice, they were watching art, a violent, state-sponsored form of it. Take the story of Prometheus. In the myth, he was chained to a rock and had his liver eaten by an eagle daily. In the Colosseum, they skipped the rock and used stage props. But the eagle part, that was real. Or the story of Orpheus, the tragic musician who tried to rescue his wife from the underworld. The Roman version, a man in a tunic with a lyre walks across the arena, and then someone quietly releases a few large, extremely uninterested animals. It did not end with music. The crowd, of course, loved it. It was culture and entertainment all in one. You could feel sophisticated for recognizing the myth and still get to point and laugh when the guy in the Apollo wig tripped over his sandals. Obviously, these were not plays. The actors weren't actors. They were people who had been sentenced to death and were now expected to help bring a story to life before exiting it in the final act. Chapter 4. A Feast of Cruel Creativity. The creativity of Roman event organizers seemed to have no limits, especially when it came to inventing new and horrifying spectacles. For point 1, Naumachii, naval battles on dry land. Just when you thought the Colosseum couldn't get any more extra, Rome said, what if we turned it into a lake? At various points in its early history, the Colosseum hosted mock naval battles called Naumachii. Roman engineers, who clearly had both talent and too much free time, figured out how to flood the arena floor with real water. The plan was simple: fill the arena floor with water, drop in a few ships, and stage a battle with real people who often knew less about rowing than the audience. These ships were smaller than real warships, but were still equipped with paint, flags, and real weapons. The audience watched from above, both confused and delighted. No one really cared about naval tactics. They wanted to see if anyone would fall out of the boat dramatically. Eventually, the Colosseum stopped flooding itself for these performances, probably because ancient concrete and water were not a sustainable long-term couple. For point 2, the accessory pack of death, blindfolds, chains, and mismatched weapons. Why be fair when injustice is more entertaining? That was the philosophy behind using gimmicks to make fights absurdly more difficult. One popular act was to have a gladiator fight while blindfolded. Another variation was to strip a gladiator of his armor, shorten his weapon, or give him something utterly useless, like a net or, worse, a wooden sword. Sometimes, gladiators were chained at the ankles, wrists, or both. There were even fights where gladiators were tied together, creating a three-legged race of death. One man stumbles, they both go down, and the crowd goes wild. For point 3, surprises from below, trapdoors, and uninvited guests. The arena floor wasn't just a plain stretch of sand. Beneath it was a labyrinth of tunnels, cages, elevators, and pulleys known as the hypogeum. This mechanical marvel allowed the stage crew to lift animals, props, or sometimes entire sets into the arena with incredible theatrical timing. You're a gladiator in the middle of a fight, and just as you're about to win, boom, the floor opens and a leopard appears. It wasn't part of the fight, just bonus content. It turned combat into a stage and the stage into absolute chaos. You weren't just fighting your opponent, you were fighting the floor, the props, and the growing suspicion that someone backstage was having a really good laugh. Chapter 5. Even the intermission was bloody meridiani. You might assume the audience would get a break between events. Technically, yes, there was an intermission, but in true Roman fashion, even that was turned into a performance. Welcome to the Meridiani, the lunchtime show. While the morning featured beast hunts and the afternoon promised gladiator matches, the lunch hour was reserved for something more procedural: public executions. The condemned, often criminals, deserters, or people who annoyed the wrong official, were brought out for the crowd to watch justice being loudly served. This wasn't a fight, it was a warning. For the audience, the executions were just filler content, like commercials, only instead of advertising soap, they illustrated why you shouldn't steal. The crowd, by this point, was used to it. Children demanded better seats. Merchants hawked snacks. Nobody blinked. If anything, they'd get annoyed if it dragged on. This shows the Colosseum wasn't just an arena, it was a carefully orchestrated performance of control. Every moment, including the intermission, was designed to remind the public who had the power and what happened when you challenged it. Chapter 6. Mob Justice and the Emperor's Nod. In modern sports, the referee makes the call. In the Roman arena, the final judgment came from thousands of spectators. After a gladiator match, the loser didn't always die immediately. If he fought well or at least flailed with enthusiasm, the final decision rested with the audience. You may have heard of the famous thumbs-down gesture meaning death. However, historians aren't entirely sure which thumb meant what. Some sources say a thumb-up meant execution, like a drawn sword, while a thumb-down meant sheathing the sword, mercy. Either way, the crowd's reaction was crucial, and they were not shy. If a gladiator was boring, he might be met with silence, the worst possible outcome. If he was entertaining, the crowd would roar for mercy or punishment. Some gladiators cultivated a following. They had fans who knew their names and might even wear carvings of them. And if the emperor was present, things quickly became political. He could overrule the crowd, granting a pardon or insisting on execution. Either way, he was reading the room like a stand-up comedian, but with much higher stakes. So, while the games looked like chaos, they had a strange sort of democracy, at least for the gladiators. If you were entertaining, you had a chance. If not, the crowd was ready to vote with their voices. Chapter 7. The Arena, the Empire's Propaganda Machine. The Colosseum wasn't just a place to entertain the masses, it was a PR machine custom-built to remind everyone exactly who was in charge. Every event, every match, every oops, we accidentally released 2 tigers moment was part of a carefully managed imperial message. Obey or else. Executions weren't just punishments, they were statements. Traitors, rebels, or just people who annoyed powerful senators were dealt with publicly and dramatically. The emperor, sitting in the best seat, wasn't just watching, he was starring. His reaction mattered. A nod from him could become a news headline. Sometimes, entire events were staged around political narratives. Celebrating a military victory? Great, let's reenact it in the arena with extras and real casualties. Hosting a foreign dignitary? Let's show them a good time with tigers. Nothing impresses a visiting official like a guy in armor jumping over a hippopotamus. The Colosseum was Rome's most violent press conference. Conclusion: the immortal legacy of a violent monument. So why did the Colosseum, with all its injustice, trapdoors, weaponized wild boars, and political overtones, last for so long? The answer is simple: Rome was addicted to spectacle. These weren't just shows, they were cultural events, political tools, social glue, and psychological therapy for a civilization in desperate need of a hobby. The empire was vast, complex, and frequently on fire, sometimes literally. But give the people a gladiator match, and suddenly things felt stable. The formula worked. Distract, dazzle, repeat. Over time, the shows became less lavish, the animals harder to import, the audiences less easily dazzled. As Rome began to crumble, even the Colosseum started to feel like yesterday's news. Yet, its legacy endures. Even today, we remember the Colosseum not as a sports stadium, but as a monument to how far a society will go for a good show. It wasn't fair. It wasn't kind. But it was unforgettable. Because when you build a stage for 50,000 people and fill it with fire, iron, and politics, you aren't aiming for subtlety. You're aiming for history. And the Colosseum delivered. Fire in the ancient world. In the flow of human history, perhaps no element is as dual-natured and profoundly influential as fire. It is a source of life, bringing warmth in the freezing winter, cooking food, warding off wild beasts, and illuminating the night. But it is also a force of destruction, capable of incinerating an entire forest, a city, a civilization in the blink of an eye. It is this powerful duality between creation and destruction, between life and death, that elevated fire from a mere physical tool to a sacred symbol in most ancient cultures around the world. To our ancestors, fire was not an explicable chemical reaction. It was a living force, a mysterious presence, a gateway connecting the visible world of humans with the invisible realm of gods, demons, and spirits. From the damp hills of Ireland to the scorching deserts of Persia, from the dense jungles of Mesoamerica to the icy fjords of Scandinavia, fire rituals became an indispensable part of the cultural and spiritual tapestry. They were not just festivals, they were dialogues with the cosmos, efforts to purify, protect, supplicate, and judge. This is a journey to explore how ancient civilizations danced, prayed, fought, and even judged by the sacred flame. Chapter 1. The Fire of Purification and Fertility, the Celtic Festival of Beltane. Imagine you are a farmer in ancient Ireland. It is April 30th, and the winds are changing. You look out over the green hills and think to yourself, it's time to light the fires again. Welcome to Beltane, the ancient Celtic fire festival, celebrated not just to mark the beginning of summer, but to survive it. While modern humans might pop open a bottle of sunscreen and complain about the heat, our ancestors were busy piling up wood and herding cattle between 2 giant, raging bonfires. Why? Because they believed the smoke and flames could purify, protect, and perhaps even impress the local spirits. In this world, fire wasn't a handy tool, it was a living force, a mediator between realms. Lighting a fire wasn't a casual act, it was a sacred ritual. The druid priests, the spiritual MVPs of the community, were in charge of the fires. They would chant, make dramatic gestures, and finally summon a central bonfire called the need fire. Every household fire in the region would then be relit from this central flame. Think of it as a spiritual reboot button, but with more sparks and fewer user manuals. As the fires blazed, villagers would lead their livestock, yes, actual cows and sheep, between the twin bonfires. It might sound a bit excessive, but this was insurance against disease and misfortune. You want your cattle to be healthy and productive? Parade them through the fire. You want to be fertile yourself? Take a daring leap over the flames. Nothing says romance like a minor burn. Couples might jump over the fire together to seal their love. Beltane was more than just a festival. It was a seasonal rite of passage, a fiery handshake between humanity and the otherworld. And once the flames died down, the ashes were scattered over the fields, spreading the fire's blessing across the land. Chapter 2. Adder. Fire as Truth in Ancient Persia. Leaving the damp hills of Celtic lands, we journey to the arid, sun-scorched heart of ancient Persia. Here, fire wasn't something to dance around while hoping your sheep stay healthy. It was a divine presence, a sacred force to be nurtured, revered, and absolutely not sneezed on. Welcome to Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, where fire is not just sacred, it is truth itself. The Persians called fire adder, a living symbol of Asha, the divine order of the universe. That meant fire wasn't just a helpful guest in the kitchen, it was a radiant representative of cosmic balance. The center of worship was the fire temples, where priests called magi tended to eternal flames that had burned for years, sometimes centuries. Think of them as sacred caretakers, equipped not with fire extinguishers, but with bundles of sandalwood and eagle feathers for gentle fanning. The idea was that this fire had to be kept alive, uninterrupted, unpolluted, and undisturbed. To let it go out was basically a cosmic insult, a sacred blunder of mythic proportions. Even funeral rites avoided letting the fire directly touch the dead. Why? Because that would defile it. The fire needed to be kept clean, pure, and non-judgmental. During major festivals like Sada and Chaharsham Suri, entire communities would light massive bonfires in public squares to celebrate creation, rebirth, and the unending battle between light and darkness. People would leap over the flames while chanting phrases like, "Give me your red color," and "Take away my sickly pallor," basically the ancient Persian version of New Year, New Me. In the Persian view, fire was not something to be tamed. It was a sacred thread connecting humanity to the divine blueprint of the universe. Chapter 3. The Torch of Wisdom and Rebellion. Fire in the Greek World. Now we sprint, quite literally, into ancient Greece, where fire festivals weren't just holy ceremonies, they were official athletic competitions. Because when the Greeks honored the gods, they didn't just pray, they ran with fire. The torch race, or lampadodromia, was the signature event. Imagine a sacred relay race, where athletes passed burning torches like flaming batons through the city of Athens. And the goal wasn't just speed, it was keeping the flame alive. If you dropped your torch or let it go out, you were disqualified. Congratulations, you failed both your city and your gods. These races were held to honor gods associated with fire and knowledge: Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, and Prometheus, the rebellious titan who famously stole fire from Mount Olympus and gave it to humanity, a daring act that earned him the punishment of having his liver eternally pecked out by an eagle from Zeus. The torch race wasn't just sport, it was ritual theater. By keeping the fire burning, the athletes symbolized the endurance of divine wisdom passed down to humans. It wasn't enough to possess fire, you had to prove you could carry it without fumbling. The races were often held at night, the only light coming from the fiery torches dancing in the darkness, casting shadows on temples, columns, and confused livestock. Prometheus's gift of fire wasn't just about warmth or cooking fuel, it represented intellect, transformation, and rebellion. In honoring him with torch races, the Greeks weren't just reenacting a myth, they were subtly reminding themselves of their own clever defiance, their pursuit of civilization. So, the next time you see a modern Olympic torch relay, know that it's not just a sporting tradition, it's a flickering echo of Greek reverence for stolen fire, cosmic rebellion, and the timeless art of running very fast without singeing your eyebrows. Chapter 4. Agni, the cosmic messenger of ancient India. From the torch races of Greece, we now turn east to ancient India, where fire wasn't stolen from the gods. Fire was a god. Meet Agni, the Hindu deity of fire, who was not just a god of warmth and light, but a cosmic mailman. His role, to deliver offerings from earth to heaven via fire with perfect reliability. In Vedic rituals, the sacred ceremonies of ancient India, Agni was the bridge between mortals and the divine. Any prayer worth its salt required a fire. And not just any fire. It had to be properly consecrated, fed with clarified butter, ghee. Basically the holy nectar of every ritual, and accompanied by chants, mantras. These rituals were called yajnas, and they were so important that priests dedicated their lives to mastering them. In a typical yajna, a sacred fire pit called a havan kund was built, often in complex geometric patterns aligned with celestial forces. The fire had to be generated by friction or sacred chants, no matches allowed. And once it was lit, Agni came alive. You weren't just watching a fire, you were making eye contact with a deity. The most devout households kept eternal fires, flames that were never allowed to die, passed down from generation to generation. If a fire died, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a spiritual emergency. Agni was not feared like a wildfire. He was revered as an ancestor, a witness to every vow, every birth, every departing soul. Chapter 5. The Breath of the Sun God, Fire and Order in Egypt. If ancient India saw fire as a divine messenger, ancient Egypt saw it as the very breath of the sun god himself. Fire here wasn't a flickering campfire. It was cosmic power embodied in Ra, the sun god who rode a fiery solar boat across the sky. Fire wasn't used for heating. It was a symbol of purification, protection, and rebirth. Temples were designed to channel the morning sun into their darkest chambers, as if the gods themselves were turning on the lights. The most famous fire festivals were the Opet Festival or the WP Rinpet Festival, marking the new year. It was a multi-day spectacle of priests, incense, offerings, and most importantly, ritual torches carried in processions. The flame represented the renewing energy of Ra returning to earth, driving out darkness and disease. Even in funerary practices, fire played a crucial but carefully managed role. The Egyptians did not cremate, but they burned incense and sacred oils during burial rites. The smoke rising from the offerings was believed to carry the essence of the soul upward, helping it on its safe journey to the afterlife. Priests also maintained eternal flames in temples, especially those dedicated to Ra or his fiery daughter, Sekhmet, a lion-headed goddess you really didn't want to upset. In the Egyptian world, fire wasn't chaotic. It was ordered, celestial, and brilliant. Every spark had a script. Chapter 6. The Engine of the Cosmos, Fire and Sacrifice in Mesoamerica. We now venture into the jungles and highlands of ancient Mesoamerica, where fire didn't just represent life. It was the engine of the cosmos. And keeping that engine running required more than candles and good thoughts. For the Aztec, Maya, and Zapotec peoples, fire was a sacred force that governed time, agriculture, and even human destiny. But they didn't mess around with mere festivals. They had cyclical fire reboots. Enter the new fire ceremony, held every 52 years when the Aztec calendar completed its sacred cycle, a kind of cosmic Y2K, only with higher stakes. As the dreaded day approached, all household fires across the land were extinguished. Cities fell into darkness. People destroyed their furniture, fasted, prayed, and basically assumed the world might end. Then, at midnight, priests climbed a sacred hill and performed a human heart sacrifice. Only after the heart was set ablaze and the new fire was kindled in the chest cavity, yes, literally, was the flame declared reborn. From this single sacred spark, every household fire across the empire would be relit. Fire was rebirth, continuity, and cosmic validation. If the fire failed to light, the sun might not rise again. In Mayan civilization, fire was also central to dedicating temples and royal ceremonies. Newly built temples were awakened with fire. For all these cultures, fire was a dialogue with the gods, but also a demand. It was hungry and it needed to be fed, not just with wood or copal resin, but with sacrifice. The smoke didn't just rise, it spoke. Chapter 7. The Goddess's Creative Wrath, Volcanic Fire in Polynesia. For ancient Polynesians, fire wasn't just a necessity, It was an origin story, a sacred inheritance passed down from the gods who lived inside the mountains. At the heart of many Polynesian fire beliefs is the goddess Pele, the fiery spirit of the volcano, especially revered in Hawaiian mythology. She was no gentle hearth goddess. She was a blazing force of nature who created the islands with her lava, then destroyed them in a fit of divine rage. Respecting fire in this culture wasn't an option, it was survival. When a volcano erupted, it wasn't a natural disaster, it was Pele expressing herself. Polynesian fire festivals took many forms, but one of the most mesmerizing is the Shiva Afi, or fire knife dance. Still performed in places like Samoa and Tonga, this dance was originally part of warrior rituals, involving the spinning of burning knives while leaping, tumbling, and generally defying common sense. It wasn't just showmanship, it was a spiritual performance. The fire knife was seen as an extension of one's inner power, a dance with ancestral might. Chapter 8. The Roots of Ice and Fire, the Vikings' Flame of Survival. You might think the frigid lands of ancient Scandinavia would be too cold and damp for fiery rituals. But the Norse, Vikings, had a relationship with fire that was anything but cool. In a land of icy fjords and eternal winters, fire meant more than comfort. It meant survival, both physically and spiritually. At the heart of Norse mythology is a cosmic duality, fire and ice. The world itself was born from the clash between Muspelheim, the realm of fire, and Niflheim, the land of ice. When the two collided, sparks literally flew, and from that chaos, the gods were born. So, fire wasn't just essential, it was both creator and destroyer. The most fearsome fire figure in Norse mythology is Surtur, a fire giant prophesied to emerge during Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse, with a flaming sword in hand. His job, to burn the world to ash. On a more earthly level, fire festivals marked seasonal changes, especially the end of winter and the return of the sun. Celebrations like Yule, later merged with Christmas, were centered around fire. Great Yule logs were burned for days, representing the rebirth of the sun. Bonfires were also lit during midsummer festivals. And when it came to death, cremation was common, and fire was believed to release the soul to Valhalla. Chapter 9. The Fire of Judgment, when fire was the supreme judge. Across the ancient world, fire did not just give life, it judged. It could warm your home or burn your legacy. For many cultures, fire became the ultimate test, an instrument of divine justice, spiritual purification, and cosmic reckoning. In ancient India, in the epic Ramayana, Sita, the wife of the hero Rama, underwent a literal trial by fire to prove her purity. The fire, Agni himself, did not harm her, thus proving her innocence. In medieval and ancient Europe, similar ideas took root in the trial by ordeal. People suspected of crimes or witchcraft were sometimes subjected to fire-based tests like holding a red-hot iron bar. If their wounds healed cleanly, they were innocent. In Zoroastrianism, one of the earliest concepts of fire as judgment appears in the concept of the Chinvat Bridge, the crossing point to the afterlife. Upon death, souls would walk a razor-thin bridge over a river of molten metal. The righteous would find it an easy walk. The wicked would discover that sacred metal was not very forgiving. In all these traditions, fire became a mirror. What you brought to it, truth, guilt, devotion, or fear, is what it would reveal. Whether in sacred rituals or terrifying trials, fire was the soul's ultimate test. Conclusion: the immortal echoes of the ancient flame. From the communal rites of the Celts to the almost scientific reverence of the Persians, from the athletic contests of the Greeks to the bloody sacrifices of the Aztecs, humanity's relationship with fire was complex and diverse. It was a god, a messenger, a mediator, a tool, and a judge. It connected the living with the dead, the mundane with the divine. Today, we may have domesticated fire, trapping it in engines, furnaces, and lighters. But the echoes of the ancient flame remain. We still gather around campfires, still light candles in ceremonies, and are still mesmerized by the flickering dance of a flame. It's a reminder of a time when the world was far more mysterious, when the line between the natural and the supernatural was thin, and when a single spark could hold the power to create, purify, and destroy all. Taxes in the ancient world. In human history, two things are certain, as Benjamin Franklin once said: death and taxes. From the first cities that sprang up in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia to the mighty empires that stretched across continents, taxes have always been a cornerstone, both the foundation upon which great works were built and the heavy stone that weighed on the people's shoulders. It was the lifeblood that funded armies, irrigation projects, magnificent temples, and vast bureaucracies. But it was also the spark for rebellions, the source of resentment, and the measure of the ruler's cruelty and greed. A civilization's tax system is not just numbers in a ledger. It is a mirror reflecting its social structure, values, philosophy, and above all, the nature of power. How a state collects taxes, whether in barley grains, bird feathers, urine, or days of hard labor, reveals much about how it views its citizens, as subjects to be protected, resources to be exploited, or simply as dairy cows to be milked dry. Let's take a journey through history, exploring the diverse, creative, and sometimes incredibly cruel ways ancient civilizations filled their treasuries, and the price the people paid for the existence of an empire. Chapter 1. Origins in Mesopotamia and Egypt, taxes on clay and papyrus. The history of taxes is as old as civilization itself. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians created the world's first tax system, and with it, the first recorded complaints about taxes in history. Instead of paper forms, scribes carved tax records into soft clay tablets with reed styluses. Thousands of these cuneiform tablets, found by archaeologists, have recorded everything from barley contributions to the number of livestock. Taxes were primarily paid in barley, the region's core agricultural product. Farmers had to give a portion of their harvest to the temple or the palace. Temples were not just religious centers. They were official economic hubs with tax officials, storage facilities, and surprisingly stern-looking priests. But barley wasn't all. Mesopotamians taxed fishermen on their catch, merchants on their goods, and craftsmen on their workshops. Even donkeys weren't safe. Under the Babylonian king Hammurabi, taxation became even more structured. His famous code, one of the oldest in the world, prescribed punishments for tax evasion, overzealous officials, and system fraud. In some cases, the punishment wasn't just a fine, it was death or mutilation. If you feel your modern tax form is harsh, remember that at least it doesn't come with the risk of amputation. A unique feature of Mesopotamian taxes was their integration into public works. Citizens could pay their taxes in bricks, silver, or labor, helping to build canals, ziggurats, and city walls. Meanwhile, in ancient Egypt, paying taxes was not just an economic duty, it was practically a spiritual one. The pharaoh was no ordinary official. He was the divine intermediary between the gods and humanity. So, when he demanded tribute, it wasn't seen as exploitation. It was seen as maintaining Ma'at, the sacred order of the universe. Currency, as we know it, didn't really exist in early Egyptian society. So how did the pharaoh fill his royal coffers? With grain. Lots and lots of grain. The annual flooding of the Nile ensured fertile fields, and after the harvest, the scribes would arrive, papyrus scrolls in hand, to measure exactly how much you owed. They used ropes, sticks, and something that looked like a calculator made of frustration. If you didn't pay, you could lose your land, your livestock, or find yourself mysteriously volunteering for a state labor project. Yes, you could also pay your taxes in labor. The pyramids of Giza were not built by aliens or slaves. They were built in part by taxpayers. If you didn't have enough grain or goods, you could be conscripted for public works. Chapter 2. The Roman Art of Extraction, from Urine to Life. Leave it to the Romans to turn bodily functions into taxable assets. In the vast empire of marble forums and gladiatorial games, taxation was both a bureaucratic art and a source of legendary grumbling. You could be taxed on your land, your slaves, your doors, and yes, your urine. Let's start with the infamous urine tax, or vectigal urini. Public toilets and fullers' workshops collected human urine, which was then used, no joke, as a source of ammonia for bleaching togas and tanning leather. So, when Emperor Vespasian realized this bodily byproduct was chemically useful, he did what any responsible emperor would do. He taxed those who collected it. The phrase, "money does not stink," pecunia non olet, was born when his son, Titus, questioned the ethics of such a tax. Vespasian handed him a coin and asked if it smelled. It didn't. Case closed. But that was just the tip of the imperial iceberg. Rome had a window tax, a slave ownership tax, and an inheritance tax that could take a large chunk of what you left behind. There was even a sales tax. The tax collectors were called publicani, and let's just say they were not beloved. These middlemen paid the state up front for the right to collect taxes, then squeezed the citizens for as much as they could to turn a profit. They were the ancient version of a private debt collection agency run by a hedge fund. And if you refused to pay, soldiers might show up to persuade you. Despite all this, Roman taxes funded some impressive projects: aqueducts, roads, temples, and the military conquests that expanded the empire from Britain to Syria. Chapter 3: Tribute and Terror, the Aztec Empire's Model. In the heart of Mesoamerica, the Aztec Empire ran one of the most complex and structured tribute systems the world has ever seen. And no, it wasn't based on gold or coins. It was powered by cacao beans, jaguar pelts, and feathers so exquisite they made European kings look underdressed. Unlike modern tax systems, Aztec taxes were called tribute, and it functioned like a giant imperial wish list. Every controlled city-state was required to send tribute, meticulously recorded by scribes called kalpixki. These men carried detailed pictorial codices illustrating what was due. Not numbers, but images. Mounds of corn, stacks of cotton, bundles of obsidian, and yes, sacks of cacao beans. Think of it as a picture invoice from hell. Cacao beans were particularly valuable, serving not just as food or drink, but as currency. They were so prized that counterfeiters tried hollowing them out and filling them with dirt. Daring, yes, but also a crime punishable by death. Tribute items could range from the delicious, like turkeys and honey, to the decorative, like jade and gold dust, to the incredibly inconvenient, like giant logs carried from forests miles away. One province had to regularly deliver embroidered warrior costumes, complete with battle-ready sandals. Another specialized in exotic bird feathers. Failure to deliver tribute could lead to violent retribution. Aztec tax collectors were not shy, and rebellious provinces were often treated to military reminders. Chapter 4: The Great Bureaucratic Machine, Salt and Rice Taxes in Ancient China. In ancient China, taxation was less about flamboyant punishments or exotic goods and more about sheer scale. With a population in the tens of millions and an empire that seemed to stretch on forever, China built a tax machine so vast and precise it would make Roman senators weep into their wine. Let's start with the basics: rice and labor. Under the Han Dynasty, farmers were the economic backbone, and they paid taxes in three main forms: grain, cloth, and corvée labor. The grain filled the imperial granaries. The cloth was given to state officials. And the labor, well, that meant weeks or months away from home working on canals, roads, or the occasional Great Wall renovation. As the empire grew, so did its taxes. The Tang Dynasty introduced the twice-a-year tax system, requiring payments twice annually, once in summer, once in autumn, calculated based on the land you owned and the people in your household. In theory, it was fair. In practice, tax collectors had a flexible understanding of fairness. And then came the salt tax, the silent empire builder. Instead of taxing everyone equally, the government slapped a heavy tax on salt, a daily necessity. Everyone needed it, especially in a pre-refrigerator age. And so, the state made a fortune. For centuries, salt revenue funded armies, palaces, and official pensions. It's no exaggeration to say that salt sponsored dynasties. But of course, overtaxation was one of the leading causes of peasant uprisings, like the Yellow Turban Rebellion that erupted at the end of the Han Dynasty. Chapter 5: Civic Duty and Evasion, Taxes in the Greek World. In ancient Greece, taxes were less about state-ordered precision and more about awkwardly passing the bill. Unlike centralized empires like Egypt or China, many Greek city-states, especially Athens, relied on a combination of civic pride, social pressure, and well-disguised tax evasion strategies. Direct taxation of citizens was rare. Instead, wealthy Athenian citizens were expected to contribute to the state through liturgies. This was a fancy way of saying, "Hey, rich guy, it's your turn to pay for a play, a warship, or a festival. It wasn't technically a tax, but try saying no and still getting invited to dinner parties. Foreigners and medics, resident aliens, meanwhile, did pay taxes. They were required to pay a monthly protection fee. Trade was another goldmine. Goods imported and exported through the bustling port of Piraeus, and Athens made sure to take its cut with customs duties, tolls, and harbor fees. Philosophers also had opinions on taxes. Plato believed rulers should live simply. Aristotle, ever the pragmatist, saw taxes as a necessary part of governance, though he noted that excessive taxes could lead to rebellion. And to collect them, Greek states auctioned off the right to collect taxes to tax farmers, who paid the state up front, then went to recover the money, plus a lot of interest. These men were famously hated. Chapter 6. When Labor Was Currency, the Inca Empire's Midas System. Welcome to the Inca Empire, where you didn't pay taxes with money or even cacao beans. You paid with your hands, your feet, and your spine. The Inca created one of the most impressive civilizations in the Americas, and they did it without coins, markets, or a written language. So how did they fund it? With a tax system based entirely on labor, called the mita. The mita wasn't a suggestion, it was mandatory state service. Every able-bodied male citizen owed the empire a certain number of days per year, typically spent building roads, farming on state lands, mining for silver, or hauling stone for temples and fortresses. Picture the Inca tax form as a calendar, not an invoice. The genius of the Midas system was its efficiency. Instead of centralizing everything in one place, the empire distributed labor across thousands of local communities called ailus. Each ailus sent its workers when called upon, and in return, the empire provided food, tools, and access to community storehouses. You gave your time and got back survival. Need a bridge across a canyon? The mita would provide. Need hundreds of miles of paved roads connecting cities like Cusco and Machu Picchu? Mita. Instead of traditional tax collectors, local leaders kept quipus, knotted strings used to track labor and production. They didn't need writing when they had the world's most complex tax abacus made of string. Tragically, after the Spanish arrived, they co-opted the mita system for forced mining labor, quickly turning it into a nightmare of exploitation and death. Chapter 7. Taxes in the Light of God, Fairness and Philosophy in the Islamic Golden Age. During the Islamic Golden Age, from the 8th to the 13th centuries, empires in the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe ran some of the world's most sophisticated tax systems. But unlike earlier models, Islamic taxes were wrapped in moral philosophy, religious duty, and meticulous bookkeeping. At the center of it all was zakat, a religious tax, and one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It wasn't just a donation, it was obligatory. Every able Muslim was expected to give about 5% of their wealth annually to help the poor, the indebted, and travelers in need. It was a tax designed not to fund palaces or armies, but to promote social justice. But zakat was just the beginning. There was also carriage, a land tax levied on non-Muslims farming conquered lands, and jizya, a poll tax paid by non-Muslims in return for protection and exemption from military service. These taxes were not arbitrary. They were legally defined and scaled to wealth. To manage all this, the caliphates developed a professional class of scribes and accountants. The state treasury, or diwan, wasn't a chaotic chest of coins, but a centralized bureaucracy with trained staff and standardized forms. Chapter 8. Tithes and Feudal Dues, the Burden of the Medieval European Peasant. In medieval Europe, paying taxes was less about civic duty and more about surviving feudal extortion with most of your limbs intact. While kings and nobles claimed divine right, it was the peasants who felt the weight of every coin, chicken, and bale of hay that vanished into the tax cart. The most infamous medieval tax was the tithe. This wasn't a state-imposed levy, but a mandatory 10% of one's income paid to the church. That meant a tenth of your crops, livestock, or fish went straight to the local monastery. Refused to pay? You weren't just evading taxes. You were risking eternal damnation. Then came the feudal dues. If you were a peasant, your life was basically a subscription service to your lord. You paid for the land you farmed, for the mill you used, for the oven where you baked your bread. Getting married? That's a fee. Inheriting your father's field? Another fee. When kings needed extra money, especially for war, They began imposing direct taxes on income and property, leading to outrage. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 erupted in response to a brutal poll tax, a flat fee per person regardless of wealth. Conclusion: from cacao beans to coins, taxes as a mirror of power. From ancient Egypt, where taxes were a cosmic duty, to Rome, where they were an art of extraction, to the Inca Empire, where your very time and energy were the tax. The history of taxation is a rich and complex story. It shows the infinite ingenuity of humans in creating systems of control and wealth redistribution. It also shows a constant truth. Where there is power, there are taxes, and where there are taxes, there is resentment. Each system, whether a tribute of feathers or a tax on clay, was a solution to the fundamental problem of running a society: how to pay for it. And each solution carried with it profound consequences, shaping the lives of millions and deciding the fate of empires. The story of taxes, therefore, is not just about economics. It's about power, control, and the delicate thread between the rulers and the ruled. One coin, one grain, one rebellion at a time. Viking funerals. In the Viking psyche, that of the bold seafarers, warriors, and explorers of the North, death was not a stopping point, a dreaded end. It was simply the beginning of a new journey, another great adventure. Their mortal lives might be short, unpredictable, and often brutal, but death, that was where the real adventure began. Depending on how you lived, and more importantly, how you died, you could find yourself in entirely different destinations in the afterlife. For the valiant warriors who fell in battle, a glorious place awaited. It could be Valhalla, the golden hall of the god Odin, where slain warriors gathered to feast, fight all day, and prepare for Ragnarok, the final apocalyptic battle. Or it could be Folkvanger, the realm of the goddess Freya, who had the right to choose half of the battlefields fallen even before Odin. Both were warrior paradises, filled with mead and endless combat. But not all souls went to a warrior's heaven. Those who died of sickness, old age, or insufficiently dramatically were thought to drift to hell, a gloomy realm ruled by the goddess of the same name. Contrary to modern interpretations, hell was not necessarily a place of punishment. It was just a quieter afterlife, perhaps with fewer drinking horns and battle hymns. With such a complex spiritual map, it's no surprise that Viking funeral rites were carefully staged performances. They were a tribute, a navigation system for the soul, and a way for the living to show off their status. A well-executed funeral demonstrated respect, wealth, and community standing. A sloppy one. That was a recipe for hauntings, bad luck, or worse, a disgraced soul wandering without rest. For the Vikings, to be remembered was to live forever. The funeral was not the final chapter. It was the first page of the afterlife. Chapter 1. Preparing for the Great Journey. Rituals for the body and spiritual luggage. In Viking society, the dead were not just put in a hole and forgotten. They were prepared with care, intention, and a bit of theatrical flair. If death was a journey, then the deceased needed to be dressed like a traveler and have their bags carefully packed. When a person passed away, their body would be washed, groomed, and dressed in its finest clothes. This was not for vanity, it was deeply symbolic. Cleanliness showed respect, and fine garments helped ensure the deceased entered the afterlife with honor. A chieftain might be laid out in a luxurious woolen tunic, his cloak trimmed with fur. A shield maiden might wear embroidered dresses adorned with brooches and beads. Jewelry was not just for show, it was spiritual luggage. Weapons were a must. A warrior might be buried with his sword, axe, or spear, along with a shield. These were not ceremonial props. They were real tools for the afterlife. After all, if you were going to be fighting all day in Valhalla, you'd want your favorite blade by your side. The dead were also supplied with grave goods: drinking horns, cooking pots, combs, dice, and sometimes food and mead. It was as if they were packing for a very long trip with a few snacks and some entertainment. These items served practical, religious, and sentimental purposes. In some cases, they were intentionally broken before burial, a practice that may have released the object's spirit for use in the afterlife. Social status played a huge role. The wealthier or more important the person, the more elaborate the preparations. There are accounts of servants or slaves being sacrificed to join their masters, though this was rare and usually reserved for high-ranking individuals. It was brutal, yes, but in the Viking belief system, it was an honor to accompany one's lord into the next world. For the Vikings, preparing the dead was not a grim task. It was an act of love, of respect, and of cosmic responsibility. They weren't just dressing a corpse. They were arming a soul for the journey ahead. Chapter 2. The Funeral Ship, Myth and Reality. When most people think of a Viking funeral, they picture a flaming ship drifting toward the horizon, its sails ablaze, carrying a warrior to Valhalla. It's an image seared into popular culture, cinematic, dramatic, and a little bit impractical. But how accurate is it? The short answer: part truth, part poetic license. The Vikings had a deep connection with their ships. These were not just vessels for transport. They were symbols of power, status, and life itself. To be buried in a ship, or even with just a part of one, was the ultimate and noblest farewell for seafarers, warriors, and nobles. However, contrary to popular belief, most Viking funeral ships were not set on fire and pushed out to sea. That image likely comes from a combination of later medieval sagas and 19th century romantic paintings. In reality, intact ship burials were rare and incredibly expensive. When they did occur, the ship was usually placed on land, the body and grave goods arranged inside, and the entire structure was then buried under a mound or burned in place. One of the most famous examples is the Oseberg burial found in Norway. It contained an exquisitely carved ship, inside which were two women in lavish attire, surrounded by textiles, sleighs, and animal sacrifices. There was no fire, only earth and legacy. Another example, the Gokstad burial, contained the body of a chieftain, his weapons, tools, and even his sacrificed horses. Again, no water, no fire, just honor and craftsmanship. That said, there were cremations that involved boats or their symbols. In some regions, smaller boats or boat-shaped outlines made of stones were used in cremation rites, with the pyre built directly on the vessel. These events were spectacular, if logistically complex. Burning a boat wasn't just for show. In the Viking belief system, fire purified the soul, sending its smoke up to the gods. It also prevented the dead from returning as restless spirits, a very real fear in Norse mythology. Chapter 3. Offerings for the Afterlife, Grave Goods, and Sacrifice. Viking funerals were not just solemn events. They were investments in the afterlife. The dead were not sent off empty-handed. Instead, they were loaded with grave goods, a sort of spiritual starter pack designed to ensure comfort, status, and survival in the next world. Almost every Viking grave, from the common farmer to the powerful jarl, lord, included tools, weapons, and personal items. But what truly set Viking funerals apart was the use of animal sacrifice. Horses were common companions in elite graves, serving as symbols of status, transportation, and power. Archaeologists have discovered graves with multiple horses, carefully arranged, clearly sacrificed for the occasion. Dogs, hawks, and even cattle also make appearances, each likely chosen for specific spiritual or symbolic reasons. In some cases, the sacrifices went beyond animals. Slaves or servants might be killed and buried with their masters. This was not random cruelty. It was considered a form of loyalty or service. Though from a modern perspective, this is undeniably grim. One of the most shocking and detailed accounts comes from the 10th century Arab diplomat, Ahmad ibn Fadlan. He described the funeral of a Rus chieftain, likely Norse settlers along the Volga River, in which a slave girl volunteered to undergo days of rituals before being ceremonially killed to accompany her master. His account, while horrifying, reveals the theatrical and religious weight the Vikings placed on death rites. Everything placed in the grave, living or inanimate, had a purpose. The Vikings believed the soul needed support, just as in life. Chapter 4. Fire and Earth, Cremation versus Inhumation. To burn or to bury? That was the Viking funeral dilemma, and the answer depended on the region, status, era, and belief. While the modern Viking image tends to lean heavily toward dramatic flames, the truth is more complex. The Vikings used both cremation and inhumation, burial of an intact body, often side by side in the same community. Cremation was dominant in the early Viking periods, especially in Sweden and parts of Denmark. The body would be placed on a pyre, surrounded by grave goods, and set ablaze. The fire was not just destruction, it was purification, a spiritual release. The rising smoke carried the soul upward. Cremation also served practical purposes. It saved space in areas with limited land and prevented wild animals from digging up shallow graves. Psychologically, cremation ensured the dead did not return. Norse mythology is filled with restless spirits, and turning a body to ash made being haunted less likely. As time went on, especially in the late Viking Age, inhumation became more common, particularly under the growing influence of Christianity, which emphasized resurrection and bodily preservation. But even before Christianity, some Viking communities preferred burial in chamber graves, boats, or wooden coffins. Interestingly, both methods often coexisted. A chieftain might be cremated on a pyre while his wife was buried nearby. The choice could reflect personal identity, social class, or regional customs. What united both rites was the attention to detail and honor. Chapter 5. The Immortal Mounds, Haugr, and the Runic Stones. In Viking culture, death didn't just remove a person from the world, it left a mark on it. And that mark was often large, unmistakable, and visible from miles away. This was the burial mound, or Haugr in Old Norse. These were not mere piles of dirt. Viking mounds were intentionally constructed monuments built with effort and care. A chieftain's mound might be raised over a buried ship or a timber-lined chamber, filled with grave goods, and sealed with layers of stone and earth. The size of the mound mattered. Bigger mound, bigger legacy. They were not just graves. They were status symbols, tangible reminders of a family's power, wealth, and lineage. While earth and stone preserved the body, rune stones preserved the name. In an oral society, where most stories were passed down by voice, rune stones were a physical anchor. They were not tombstones in the modern sense. You weren't placing a small plaque next to a plot of land. You were erecting a public monument, standing along roads, near bridges, at crossroads, and beside burial mounds. The inscriptions were written in runes. Some were simple. Gunnar raised this stone in memory of his brother. Others were sprawling epics recounting voyages, battles, and deeds. Some even included curses for anyone who dared to deface or move the stone. A famous example is the Jelling stones in Denmark, raised by King Harald Bluetooth to honor his parents and proclaim the Christianization of Denmark. Chapter 6. The Rituals of the Living, Laments, Toasts, and Memorials. Viking funerals were not silent affairs. They were ritual-filled send-offs with songs, storytelling, toasts, and symbolic acts. At the heart of many Viking funerals were songs and poetry. Skalds, or poets, played a vital role in preserving the memory of the deceased. They composed eulogies and funeral verses, recounting the person's deeds, lineage, victories, and even their personality quirks. These verses were not just sad. They were epic, casting the dead in the mold of saga heroes. Funerals also included ritual toasting, known as minne. Drinking horns were passed, mead flowed, and each toast honored not only the deceased, but also the gods, the ancestors, and fate itself. They were solemn moments, but also deeply social, blending mourning with camaraderie. Offerings were made at the gravesite, sometimes of food, sometimes of weapons, sometimes of blood. Finally, memorial feasts could be held weeks later. These feasts served to settle affairs, redistribute property, and honor the legacy. New leaders might be named, oaths sworn, stories retold. For the Vikings, death wasn't just a loss. It was a story to be told, a song to be sung, and a life to be honored with fire, voice, and ale. Chapter 7. The Greatest Fear, When the Dead Won't Rest, Draugr. For all their strength and stoicism, the Vikings had one persistent fear that fire, stone, or sword could not easily solve: the dead who refused to die. Because in Norse belief, not all spirits departed peacefully. Some lingered, some returned, and some refused to leave at all. These were the Draugr, the restless undead, rising from their graves with swollen bodies, glowing eyes, and a very bad attitude. They were not ethereal ghosts. They were physical, dangerous, and full of malice, known for crushing bones, breaking down doors, and sometimes sitting on sleeping people like a sweaty boulder of vengeance. What made someone become a Draugr? Usually a bad death or a bad life. The greedy, the violent, or the dishonorable were prime candidates. So were those with unfinished business, jealousy, revenge, a sword debt, or just a deep-seated hatred of their relatives. A poorly performed funeral could also result in an unhappy spirit. To prevent this, Viking funerals included protective rituals. Sometimes, the body was buried with heavy stones placed on top to literally pin it down. Other graves show signs of being stabbed with spears or stakes. In cremations, the body was thoroughly burned, not just to purify, but to destroy the form to which a Draugr could return. Conclusion: to be remembered is to be immortal. The Viking funeral was a complex tapestry woven from threads of belief, social status, community ritual, and personal fear. It was not a single event, but a long process, beginning with the last breath and continuing forever in memory, in stories, and in stone. From the meticulous preparation of the body with its luggage for the afterlife, to the choice between the purifying flame and the protective earth, to the erection of monumental mounds and runed stones. Every action was driven by the twin goals of ensuring a safe journey for the departed soul and creating an immortal legacy for the living to remember. In a world where life was fragile, immortality was found not in prolonging existence, but in leaving a story great enough to be retold for generations. For a Viking warrior, reaching Valhalla was a glory, but having your name carved in runic stone and sung in the mead halls, that was the ultimate victory.